Hello, my name is Jorge Montiel. I am a PhD candidate in philosophy at Marquette University. I also serve as the graduate assistant for the Center of the Advancement of the Humanities, the CIFA. I would like to thank Dr. Laura Matthew for joining me today for the second installment of the Talking Humanities project. Dr. Matthew, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
The Talking Humanities project consists in a series of interviews sponsored by the CIFA with faculty from the College of Arts and Sciences at Marquette. The purpose of the Talking Humanities project is to clarify the role of the humanities in responding to a world convulsed by social injustice and existential threats posed to humanity, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or climate change. At the CIFA, we hope that these conversations will help discern the importance of a Jesuit humanistic education in the formation of professionals facing a complex and demanding world. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Laura Matthew to the Talking Humanities project. Dr. Matthew is an associate professor of history at Marquette, where she also serves as the director of the Latin American Latinx Studies program. Dr. Matthew completed her master's degree in Latin American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and her PhD in history at the University of Pennsylvania. At Marquette, she has taught courses on the history of Latin America, the history of Mexico, and a course on the histories behind the current immigration debate titled Mexicans, Mesoamericans, Americans. Dr. Matthew's research focuses on the history of southern Mesoamerica, which is a cultural area extending from central Mexico all the way to Central America. And she focuses especially on Guatemala under the Spanish colonial rule. Dr. Matthew is interested in how people create community, identity, and attachment to place after long migrations or under radically changed historical circumstances. Dr. Matthew's first two books focus on the histories of Mesoamerican indigenous allies of Spanish Empire. Her co-edited volume from 2007 titled Indian Conquistadors, Indigenous Allies in the Conquest of Mesoamerica, shows how Mesoamerican peoples and their methods of warfare were central in conquest, which will later be attributed to Spanish colonizers. Similarly, in her monograph from 2012 titled Memories of Conquest, Becoming Mexicano in Colonial Guatemala, which was translated to Spanish in 2015, Dr. Matthew examines a colony of indigenous allies of the Spanish who maintained a memory of their origins and the privileged social and political space they created for themselves under colonial rule. Dr. Matthew has also published numerous articles in journals such as Mesoamerica, the Journal of Colonialism and Colonial History, and Ethnohistory. Dr. Matthew, thank you again for taking the time to talk to us about the humanities.
I'm really pleased to be invited. Thank you, Jorge.
I would like to divide my questions into two broad segments. First, I would like to start by asking you some general questions about the academic history and the humanities. And second, I would like to focus on questions about the Latin American Latinx Studies program and how it is preparing Marquette students to approach some of the social and existential challenges we face today. Let me start with a broad question about the importance of history for a humanistic education. It seems to me that there's a national trend in higher education towards prioritizing teaching technical skills over a more holistic view of education. One aspect that makes Marquette distinct is its emphasis on the humanities. In your view, how do undergraduate students benefit from a humanistic education, and particularly from the study of disciplines such as history?
There's going to be lots of different answers to that question from different people. I want to home in on maybe the idea of complexity. I think that the thing that the humanities in particular, and I think if we move over to the social sciences, you see some of this too. The humanities is really comfortable with things being very, very complex and asking complex questions. So we're using quantitative and qualitative methods, but we're looking for meanings. that might not, looking for different ways to approach and look at the same problem, admitting into the conversation and into our analysis the possibility that the tools that we might use in one discipline, or even just our own positionality, our own perspective, our own training, or our own experience as human beings, might be limiting our ability to fully comprehend something that we're trying to analyze. And so I think that being comfortable, not just approaching with the expectation of complexity, but being comfortable sort of sitting with that, it also breeds a kind of humility, I think, that's really important if we're going to analyze something that's extremely complex, that can't be reduced just to a single experiment or a single kind of analysis. So I think that's something the humanities is really good at. You also asked about my own discipline of history, I think. Let's see, what shall I say about history? History, I think, reflects that really well because we're confronted as historians with all sorts of materials, usually materials that are coming out of an archive, so little bits of paper that have usually been created by the people that had access to the paper, the pen, the scribes, the time, the reasons to make sort of little scratches on paper and leave a trace in an archive. But if you just think back, we know that only maybe, I'm going to make up a number, very, very little of all of the people and places and events and non-human beings and all of the things that have happened in the past are not in the archive. Right. So a historian is first presented with, okay, I have a lot of material. What's the best method for analyzing this particular material? Do I want to confine myself to a narrative approach or an analytical, quantitative, data-driven approach? What kinds of threads can I pull out to make that into a story that people can actually kind of follow and it has some meaning to it? And then also what's being left out? And sometimes I think that's the most important question of all. What am I not seeing? Historians are always asking that question. It's important to study history. Then again, this is a lot of different answers, but I think James Baldwin said it best. History is always with us. It doesn't matter if we're ignorant of it or not. It's there, and it's forming what we do. We're carrying a lot of stuff around with us. We all have a sort of trail of our identities, where we come from, the way other people perceive us, and we can be ignorant of that or not. But I think we increase our own maneuverability, our ability to reach our goals, our ability to analyze other parts of our world with which we're interacting if we are a little smarter about it, investigate a little bit where we came from.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you so much. One of the most complex regions in the world today is Latin America, and you are the director of the Latin American Latinx Studies program at Marquette. Can you give us a general sense? This may be a huge question to ask, but can you give us a sort of a brief overview or a sense of how Latin America and Latinx as a region and as a group of people became a field of study in the U.S.? And what do you think are the sort of the central issues that this academic field aims to address?
That is a big question. You're being very daring and asking somebody like me a question like that. But it has a pretty straightforward answer. So Latin American studies, the first thing I'll say is Latin American studies and Latinx studies are two different fields. They're mutually overlapping and complementary. And I think that's probably pretty intuitive why that would be. Latin American studies is a little bit older as an academic field in the United States, and it was really born in the United States in some ways, although you also see some interesting parallels in Latin American itself. But that goes all the way back to maybe the first quarter, but late, getting more towards World War II, the 1930s and 1940s especially. There was this idea of Pan-Americanism. There was a real idea, and especially I say World War II because especially when the whole hemisphere of the Americas was confronted. Each individual country was confronted with which side they were going to be on and how they were going to be involved in the World War. There was a real sense of wanting to collaborate and cooperate militarily, internationally, diplomatically, etc. And that then spawned the field of Latin American studies in the United States, which then after World War II, during the Cold War, also was a very important field in the United States. And I think this is actually an interesting part of the history of Latin American studies, because in the Cold War, the United States turned towards more covert actions. We did a lot of military assistance to conservative and right-wing governments and military dictatorships in Latin America. And had a lot of covert actions from the CIA as well. All through that time, Latin American studies was being taught as a field in the United States, and actually worked to kind of challenge some of that foreign policy as well. Latinx studies is based in the United States, and Latinx studies is about people of Latin American descent writ large. We could have interesting discussions, for instance, like a very important group of immigrants in the United States and American citizens, which would be Filipino Americans, kind of belong to Latin America and also belong to Asia. But Latinx studies is about the experience historically and culturally of those people of Latin American descent in the United States. This was born really, some of the earliest programs in universities was around like 1970, late 1960s. It's especially coming out of the Chicano studies movement, which is about Mexican Americans specifically, because Mexican Americans, like African Americans, have been a part of the fabric of this country for such a very long time, and have been a very important Latin American descendant group in this country. So Latinx studies is a little bit younger as a field and is more focused on ethnic studies. It correlates very well at Marquette with our race, ethnic, and indigenous studies program.
What do you think are some of the main issues that Latin American studies and Latinx studies are aim to address generally? They understand they would deal with, right, given the history that you just kind of sketched for us. I would assume that, Latin America seems to have been born out of sort of geopolitical, right, concerns, whereas Latinx, the Latinx program or Latinx programs come out of almost like social movements, grassroots movements in the U.S. What do you think are some of the main central questions that these two fields of study aim to address?
Yeah. For Latin America, I think you've put your finger right on it. Latin American studies was very much born out of a kind of geopolitical interest in looking at the hemisphere as an entire hemisphere. And in that way, I think Latin American studies in particular can tell us a lot about those kinds of questions, but now increasingly not just about geopolitical questions, but also and sort of policy questions, but also environmental questions, for example, which nothing that we do doesn't have an effect somewhere else and vice versa. And it helps us have a much bigger perspective, I think, also on some of the same challenges that we face in the United States. Latin America is a great mirror because we were all born in sort of the same moment of the birth of the nation state and the idea of a liberal democratic society. So you start with the US American Revolution, and you have the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution, all sort of happening at the same time. You've got Simón Bolívar down in South America sending people up to communicate and looking at the US model and talking with people in the United States about what kind of constitution he wants to put into place in the northern part of South America. And all these guys were, and women, although most of the political figures were men at the time, were communicating with one another. they all had to face, to a greater or lesser extent, the reality of the African Americas, which was incredibly embedded already into the fabric of all of these nascent countries, right? And so when we talk about the development of racism as an idea and racism as it developed in the Americas, it's just a really useful tool to be able to think about it, not just in our own immediate nation state as it's bounded, but in all of these other places that were confronting the same kinds of questions and embarking on the same sorts of political experiments. That thread is absolutely constant all the way through to the present day. So I find it a really useful tool. For Latinx studies, it's the same thing, right? But I'm going to flip it back a little bit too. It's so joyful. It is so joyful to appreciate and understand the history of people of Latin American descent in this country, which, as I've already said, is incredibly deep and rich. And although Mexico has had a huge imprint, there are many other places that are equally important and have just as rich of a through line in U.S. history and belong to that narrative, as it is to understand all of the cultural and historical richness that they continue to weave into our own national narrative. My life would be so much poorer if I just feel so fortunate that I've been allowed to learn about, celebrate with, enjoy just aesthetically and artistically and in every way possible, enjoy the richness of all of this history and culture that is all around us. We just have to pull it out, I think, a little bit better here in the United States.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Now I would like to move towards more specific questions about how the Latin American Latinx Studies program at Marquette is preparing students, Marquette students, to confront some of the social and existential crises we're living today. One of the pressing issues we are living in the U.S. or we're facing in the U.S. is the issue of immigration. And this is, and particularly these days, from Central American countries. And this is an issue that concerns many Marquette students who trace our genealogical background to Latin America. Can you give us a sense? I know one of your interests is on immigration, and your work focuses on Central America. Can you give us a sense of some of the factors that are forcing people to leave their countries? And what are some of the conditions that they're finding in their receiving countries such as the U.S., primarily the U.S.?
Yeah, we're living in a really interesting and important moment in migration history worldwide. So I'm glad that you asked that questions, because I do think it's really important. And one of the things that's interesting in the United States, some people watching may not realize this, we're in a kind of different phase where we saw a really intense period of migration and immigration from Mexico starting around mid-1970s, really picking up in the 80s. And just if you look at it on a graph, it's just like, woo, till about 2008, 2010. And since 2010, that has been decreasing. So if you look at the graph, it'll go up, and now it's starting to kind of go down, and it's been steadily going down. But that means that we have, a very, very important part of our nation that are now families that have been here for 30 or 40 years, somewhere along that line, a couple of decades now, that were part of that really important wave of Mexican migration that's now decreasing. And now, as you mentioned, Jorge, we've got more Central Americans, also Asians, and also African groups. All of those immigrants are increasing. And migration, the reasons for migration are so complex and individual. And this is what I think makes it so challenging to study, because oftentimes the things that are driving any particular individual or any particular region, if there are commonalities, are all mixed up. So, and they're really hard to disentangle the different reasons. So I'll just use Guatemala as where I work, primarily, also a bit in El Salvador and southern Mexico. So I'll use Guatemala as an example, just taking that one country and trying to generalize a little bit. If you start in the 80s, which is when migration from Guatemala to the United States really started, there weren't very many people at all that were coming from Guatemala to the United States before then. The first people were war refugees. Guatemala was in the middle of one of the longest civil conflicts of the Cold War in Latin America. It's recently been considered by Guatemalan courts a genocide, especially against the Guatemalan Maya, various groups that live in the kind of northern highland part that is along the U.S. Guatemala border, not U.S., the Mexico Guatemala border. So those people were being helped out oftentimes, as there's a big movement here in the Midwest of helping refugees from the war. There were big refugee camps also on the Mexican side of the border with Guatemala. And sometimes entire villages were being massacred by the Guatemalan military, which was being supported by the United States. So this was a tricky thing for the United States. You had kind of a debate going on within the United States about all of this. They were bringing their families. Sometimes, many family groups are starting to come. And also, though, when they get here, they find jobs, they start going to school, their kids are growing up here, all the things that happen normally in a kind of migration kind of story. As you go into the 2000s, after that civil conflict is over officially, the state is very weak. This happened in El Salvador and Honduras as well for different reasons. The state was very weak at the end of all of these Cold War conflicts. And you start to see organized crime also step in. So as the drug trade and organized crime starts to enter into Guatemala in the 2000s, people start to leave for that reason as well. And then you get to sort of the late 2000s, organized crime, much of it coming from new cartels that are coming from Mexico, is starting to actually enter into the migration process itself. And so you go from maybe paying somebody to help you get through Mexico or to you land and you get on a bus and are shipped immediately over to Immokalee, Florida to go pick broccoli, where, by the way, they are recruiting Maya to come and work in meatpacking plants and in broccoli and tomato fields in Florida, et cetera, because they're cheap labor. But you start to have organized crime reach into that. And now if you want to get through safely, you better pay off the people along the way going through Mexico who are involved in the cartels. And increasingly, the cartels start to kidnap people, extort family members who are living in the United States. They'll take a migrant cell phone and find who their contacts are and say, well, if you don't wire X amount of money right now, because they assume the family member in the United States can pay up. All of this is just a good illustration of how much this is a moving target too. The last thing that I would say most recently is we're starting to hear quite a bit too, amongst all these other reasons. Family members are in the United States. You can earn, more money in the United States and have a better and more secure sort of standard of living. You might be fleeing violence at home as well. And increasingly now we're hearing about what are now starting to be called climate refugees. There's a dry corridor. It's called the dry corridor that runs from Honduras, El Salvador through Guatemala, which has been suffering some really serious droughts in the recent years. And so people are not being able to feed themselves because many of these people are actually subsistence farmers who are working on the side, maybe doing coffee or broccoli or something like that and selling it and then having a plot for their own food. And it's just become very, very difficult to grow. So that's another new kind of thing that has just recently become more apparent.
Thank you. What do you think are some of the conditions these migrants generally? I understand that you're focusing on the case of Guatemala, and it's different in the case of Mexican migrants, Puerto Rican migrants, um, Salvadorian migrants, and Guatemalan migrants. But what are some of the conditions that you see in terms of the U.S. reception of these peoples coming to the U.S.?
One thing that I see that I would mention is that a lot of white Americans, well, and I would say it's not just white Americans, Americans who aren't of Latin American descent, don't necessarily understand the differences. So, for instance, they won't understand that a Puerto Rican's already a U.S. citizen. They don't even realize that Puerto Rico is an American colony. And so Puerto Ricans can travel freely. They don't necessarily know that Cubans used to be able, until very, very recently, the minute that they stepped foot on American soil, they were automatically sort of fast-tracked to special kind of a route to citizenship, which was not something that other migrants, whether they came from Latin America or not, were allowed to do until that was taken away during the Obama administration as one of the things that was the kind of very short-lived, as it turned out, opening up to Cuba. So I think that's something that I wish. And then I think there is, I mentioned white Americans, I think there is a persistent kind of racism towards brownness. So the way people look does impact the way that they're received into this country oftentimes, and people make judgments or assumptions based on the way people are looking. I gave a talk some months ago for the American Historical Association where I talked a little bit about this. Central American migrants are Mesoamericans, meaning, and especially coming from Guatemala, but also from Honduras and El Salvador, whether they still speak indigenous languages or not. They look visibly indigenous. They look visibly Mesoamerican. They have brown skin. And they are often just considered what the historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez calls Mexican brown, right? That sort of making us, and in fact, I grew up in Texas, and I think my own grandparents who, were extremely racist towards the Mexican American, the Tejano population in Texas. It was to be Mexican was to be Indian with a capital I, and that was a racialized term. So I don't think that most people in the United States that aren't Latin American understand the difference between, and the historical baggage and the cultures that are different from someone from Ecuador versus someone from Puerto Rico versus someone from Argentina versus someone from Mexico, etc.
Thank you so much for that. You mentioned, touching on this question of immigration, you mentioned issues of climate change, and this is one of the most important, perhaps, existential challenges after COVID-19, of course, existential challenges we face globally today. Latin American countries, and particularly countries from the Caribbean, are insisting that they're facing a disproportionate burden when it comes to climate change vis-a-vis other developed countries. What are some of the tools that the Latinx or Latin American Latinx Studies program at Marquette is offering students to confront these issues of the issue, particularly of climate change?
Well, the first thing I would say is knowledge. We have a lot of people working directly in Latin America, but then we also have people working in political science, in development issues, Monica Onda Gutierrez, for example, or in my class, we talk quite a bit. We read the environmental history of Latin America. It's important, again, it's just important to be aware of the things that are going on in other parts of the world, again, because we're connected to them, right? So much of what's happening in terms of climate change is happening in Latin America, whether we see it or not. So most of us, probably everybody listening, has thought about Brazil and the burning Amazon. That has that sort of incursion into the Amazon goes all the way back, at least into the 1960s. And this is part of this idea of development, which I think is an idea that probably many people in their classes, students in their classes, have interrogated a little bit. Like, what do we mean when we say that? And what kind of dichotomies or comparisons are we setting up? But if you think about, so what is the Amazon being cut down for? Things like soybeans, which for a while were being used for biofuel, so uneconomically friendly. It was supposedly substitute for petroleum, but it has its own environmental consequences, which we can see quite clearly now with the clear cutting of the Amazon and the burning of it, because that forest canopy is lost. Meat, anytime you go to McDonald's or Burger King, for a long time, Brazilian cattle was another huge consumer of the Amazon forest. Increasingly, China is buying up some of the soybeans and these other materials, or wood, right, for your cheap IKEA furniture, or to feed agro-industrial farming in China. All of this is driving deforestation, and we're involved in it as consumers, if nothing else. Right. So to being able to see those connections internationally and where we are in the supply chain, and how our, and then thinking about those questions of consumption really seriously, I think is important. I also think Latin America presents a really important history of resource management and extraction. And, sometimes it's very depressing, or it's like negative examples of resource extraction and management history. And sometimes it's really positive. So cautionary tales, you can start with silver mining at Potosi in Bolivia that the Spanish were doing. And they took a mountain that was so full of silver that they pulled all of the silver out and distributed that all through Europe, and really European imperialism writ large in some ways, and the banking industry and all sorts of things were transformed by this sudden rush of precious metal into Europe. But Potosi itself was completely stripped of all of its silver within about 200 years. So it's really a quite amazing story. Guano, which was in Peru, harvested primarily by Chinese laborers who were brought over by the British, who came to an agreement with Peru, with the Peruvian state, to kind of share the wealth. But they got first dibs at what was this incredible fertilizer, which gave us the birth of agro-industrial farming. We could only be eating and producing the food that we produce now at the sort of quantities that we produce it. Because of this discovery of what happens when you apply this very strong fertilizer, which later was replaced by chemical fertilizers. But the Peruvian states, really, this is a really interesting case, because the Peruvian state is an interesting example of when they saw that the guano, the cormorant birds that were producing this guano is, basically bird shit that's been petrified over years and years and years, and it's really potent. It was threatening the existence of the birds themselves. The Peruvian state went in and started regulating that, and basically managed to save the cormorant population. The Peruvian state's also been very active in assessing, for example, glaciers in the Andes and glacier melt, flooding, and now increasingly receding. The glaciers are actually disappearing now. And so you can see lots of interesting positive examples. Another interesting example, we have a bus rapid transit that's being developed in Milwaukee going out to the suburbs now. That was the first example of that being implemented successfully in a city-wide metropolitan way was in Brazil. And then it was adopted by Bogota, Colombia. And this was, 25 years ago. So we learn a lot from these experiments in other places, even if we don't realize that that's what we're doing necessarily.
Interesting. I have so many questions to. I would like to ask so many follow-up questions. Can I do one follow-up question?
Yeah.
Lithium. Many of the examples, the example of Potosi, for example, is, we can make a parallel with the case of lithium, right? Developing countries' discourse on climate change is focused on changing, creating new kinds of cars, right? Cars fueled by electricity. And lithium is one of those, is perhaps is the resource, right, that we need for this technological change to happen. And it turns out that countries like Bolivia and now countries like Mexico are discovering that these are rich countries in lithium. And so just like the case of Peru, right, that started regulating how we are extracting these resources, so is Bolivia, and so is Mexico, trying to regulate these resources. What do you think is? How do you see the scenario with lithium between developed countries who they're moving to electric cars on the one hand, and on the other hand, Latin American countries who are rich on the primary resources, but don't have the technology to develop the same technologies as developed countries?
Yeah, it presents really difficult questions, doesn't it? Because, for instance, with Bolivia or any country that has these resources, or Venezuela with oil, which is more short term, right? So that's
right.
Has there, or Guyana. I was reading something about Guyana. They just, I think it was Guyana. It was one of the countries there on the northeastern side of South America, just north of Brazil. Recently had oil discovered, and on the one hand, these are poor countries. They have a lot of needs and not many ways to fund any of their own infrastructure or programs, or feed their, for people to find good work, etc. And particularly as, for instance, if they're coastal areas and the waters start to rise, some traditional fisheries and things that might once have been reliable sources of economic stability are going away as well. And so in the short term, they're developing mining ventures in the case of lithium or something like that, or oil, that then they have to decide if it's a strong enough state, where this is our resource. This is written into the Mexican Constitution, right, from the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century, that these are the rights of the nation. So the nation state sort of claims this for the common good. And Latin American nations, all through the nation state period, have a slightly stronger emphasis on the state's responsibility for the common good. Even very conservative governments in Latin America have not had quite as individualist a tone as the emphasis on, say, property rights and the rights of the individual in the U.S. approach to this kind of idea of republicanism and liberal democracy. At the same time, sometimes those things are resisted at the local level, and sometimes they're not very regulated at all. So I'll give you the example. In Mexico, there were very strong indigenous protests against some of these big development projects that were being funded internationally and by Mexican banks as pro-environmental projects. So a big wind farm, for example, in Tehuantepec, Oaxaca. But from the indigenous point of view, it was like, yeah, this is like every other big development project. It comes in, it generates electricity for Mexico City, and our traditional lands are ruined, and we're left with nothing. And we don't necessarily agree to this. Or mining in El Salvador or in Guatemala, where they have security personnel, private security personnel, that sometimes have left, these are post-conflict societies, sometimes have left the security forces from the war, or the guerrilla from the war period. And when people come and protest a gold mine that's just coming to kind of quick strip mine, see if there's anything there that's worth taking, and then get out if there's not, but it leaves behind, right, this mess. And, many of those land defenders and water defenders have been murdered by private security forces. So that's kind of two extremes. The state as the guardian and developer And if they can successfully do this without causing too much environmental damage, and then the short and the long-term goals versus the state that is very weak and or chooses to allow a kind of impunity of development to happen because something's in it for them.
Thank you so much. So lastly, you became the director of the Latin American Latinx Studies program in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, which is, it was a time of much uncertainty about the future. What is your vision for the future of the Latin American Latinx Studies program at Marquette?
Well, first of all, let me shout out my colleagues in language, literatures, and cultures, because it was because of them that we managed to finally consolidate both of these programs, and they deserve an awful lot of credit for starting it and then kind of carrying it forward. I have two different goals for Latinx Studies in particular, which I think is a program that really deserves more investment and has a lot of potential to grow, particularly as we're moving towards Hispanic Serving Institution designation, we hope. And we know that many more of our students are going to be of Latin American descent, but with their roots here in the United States going forward. And that's a really exciting thing. So I'd love to have a few more senior hires, by which I mean professors trained in Latinx studies who can kind of take the helm and the leadership of that program and really just let it grow and blossom so that we can, when students come here, we're already on the ground and we're visible and we're there. And that is my second goal, that along with Latin American studies and Latinx studies together, because we are so mutual in our interests, we have a lot of resources here. We have a lot of students here. We have a lot of community resources here, and I would like us just to be out there more on campus and in the community so that we see each other, we can make this history and this culture really visible, and that other students and other parts of the Marquette community can share with it, because it is such an amazingly enriching thing to have around us. So I would just like us to get out there more and be more dynamically visible to everybody.
Thank you so much. Dr. Matthew, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today about the humanities. It has been such a thought-provoking conversation, and one that requires us to think about our jobs in the humanities in more global, holistic, and engaging ways. Thank you again for taking the time.
It's always so nice to see you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.